selling anything. I just didn't want to have to take it off and put it back on. So nothing's for sale, but everything is for you to look at. The other thing I wanted to mention is that normally I wouldn't do this, but I'm gonna have an exhibit, a one-man exhibit at the Jaffrey Civic Center in July. And so I have a little clip for you to take to remind yourself if you're in the neighborhood to come by. But the thing that makes that very special is, I don't know if any of you know Wallace Tripp, but 20 years ago, Wallace Tripp was probably the biggest name in art in this area. He did 9 children's books of his own. He illustrated 35 books for other people. And he had Paw Prints, a greeting card company. And then about 20 years ago, almost, he came down with Parkinson's disease, and he can't hold a pen. But I have a book of his that shows some of the things that he did, and these are the kind of cards he did. He gave human characteristics to animals, and there's a name for it, but I can never remember it. And so anyway, Wallace is going to be a guest artist at my exhibit. He can't talk, he can't interact with you, but I wanted to have him have a chance, after all these years that he hasn't been able to do anything, to show some of the people that haven't seen that thing a chance to look at it. So when I have this show, he will be have an exhibit area, all of his stuff. Okay, so that takes care of that business, and I wanted to tell you that what we're going to do today. Some of you, I think, have been to my studio, an open studio tour that I've been involved with, and you've seen a lot of things. I work in all media. I work in watercolor, oil. I guess the only one I don't do is pastel. I do pen and ink, I do pencil, and I do etchings. And of all the things that people look at these exhibits, the thing that puzzles them most, I think, are etchings, because etchings are not a very common thing anymore. They were at one time. An etching is making an image on a metal plate and then putting that metal plate to paper and taking your etching, taking your image off the metal plate and be able to display it on paper. That process was developed in 1446. And, you know, in the old days, they used to say the master of Keene, the master of this, the master of that. Anytime an artist broke out, he was a master of some type of art or came from some area, and he was always called the master. So this was the master of greeting cards that first did intaglio printing in 1446. And that was his business, making greeting cards, these very elaborate greeting cards. I said playing cards.
Oh,
Playing cards, yes, not greeting cards, playing cards. And they were very elaborate with all our kings and queens and princesses and all that on them and everything. And then it wasn't until probably the end of that century, the end of the 15th century, that we got another process called dry point etching. And I'm going to show you both today. I want to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in etching. I was one of these madmen that you've seen on television for 13 years in New York City. And I don't know if that tells you or not, but I didn't have much time for art because of all the way madmen lived. A lot of socializing and a lot of partying and everything else. But I did have an art degree, and I had just gotten out of the Army, and I was ready to set the world on fire from an art standpoint, except that I had no samples. I couldn't show anybody anything that I did. And so I went to work for the largest advertising agency in the world at that time, in the Young and Rude camp. We had, back then, we had 600 people in the New York office. Probably 60 of them were artists or art directors. And we had writers, marketing people, everything. They had what they called a product group, where you'd have a number of artists, number of writers, number of management people, number of merchandising people, marketing people. and that would be your product group, and you would be assigned to like Goodyear tires, and you would develop the advertising for that. Living in New York is very difficult for someone just starting out because you don't have money. Money is sort of important because everything costs so much too. So, but I had a nice apartment, but it wasn't the kind of thing that you would set up an easel or a studio or an oil painting set up in. There just wasn't enough room. So I chose to do the thing that I could do on my kitchen table, which is pen and ink. Pen and ink drawing. I was always enthralled by etching. I loved the etchings that Rembrandt and some of the great ones did. And so I was always enthralled by that. And I did pen and ink drawings to simulate etchings. Most people that work in pen and ink do a lot of line. You see a lot of line drawings of things. But I did a lot of tone and things that you see in etching. And I even, these are examples of cross-hatching done with pen and ink to make it look like etchings. I don't have it here because they're matted, but I even rounded the corners like they do with an etching. So anyway, these will be available for you to look at. But it shows you why I was involved with etching in the beginning was because I didn't have an elaborate setup for anything else. Now the etching setup, the lab or studio that you need for etching is quite large. You should have a room this size, and there are different things in the room. Of course, you have the press that you print with, and you have the acid baths and so forth. I'll take you through that. I'm going to show you a plate. This is the original plate for this etching.
Wow. Oh, wow. Wow.
So in describing how we created this plate, and this is 40 years old. I'll pass this around. You can see that there's decomposition harmed or not, but that's what happens to a 40-year-old plate.
What's the plate made of?
That's copper.
Copper.
There are two main metals that we use, copper and zinc. And zinc is what you might consider a student material because it's not as costly as copper. That was another thing that was very expensive, is the material that you need with the copper plate. And when I was involved with the advertising agency in New York, many of my art directors that I worked with were teachers at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And I saw that as an opportunity to do etching, which I have always admired. And so I went to a night school, School of Visual Arts, for a semester, and I think I produced about 18 etchings, all of which I still have and all of which I still enjoy. And I think one of the main things was that not having any money, you were so careful. I mean, I had an expensive copper plate that I had to miss a couple meals to buy that copper plate. And so I wasn't going to follow it up by not following the instructions. I probably followed the instructor's instructions for teaching more closely than anybody. At any rate, I never ruined a plate, and I always was able to turn out a fairly nice etching.
Excuse me.
When I talked about the development of intaglio, this is called intaglio printing, which is there. Before it was developed, say this was your plate. Before intaglio was printed, they would take an area that was eaten away from the surface, like let's say this. As you see on my plate here, those lines were all taken away. It's below the surface. And before that, they would print. They would say a piece of paper would go on top of that after it had been inked, right? This plate had been inked and everything that would come off was positive space. None of this would show on your print because it was lower than the other area on the surface. So that's the old way of doing it. I mean, they had be able to lay a piece of paper on something that was that could be covered with paint. And then when you take that paper off, it was the raised areas that showed. In Taglio, the thing that made it different was by etching an area, they developed the process of putting moist paper. If I go through the steps on this, it would be like this. First you take the plate, which is copper plate, and you have to make sure that it's extremely clean. So you use soap and hot water. You make sure that's very clean. And one of the things in the lab is a hot plate. It's not the kind of hot plates that we have in our homes occasionally, like a big 24 by 24 slab of steel that gets heated. And you put your plate, when you cleaned it, on that, and you cover it with an acid-resistant material. And that's usually, it comes in a ball, and you would rub the warm plate with that, and then get a certain amount of material on the plate, and then you take a roller and roll that so that the plate is completely covered with this material that is immune to acid. Acid won't touch it, won't hurt it. So after you have that plate with that on, you take a drawing that you want to transpose. I had a pencil drawing of that, and with a very soft lead, and I laid that paper on top of the plate, and then I ran that plate through the press, and that pencil lines came off on that material that I had just put on the plate. I could read it, I could see it. So then I could take my tools and start working on those lines. And we have several kinds of tools. We have an etching tool, which is really just a long needle that you draw with on the plate. And what you're doing is drawing through that acid resist that's on there. You draw through that down to the surface of the plate. And then when you can see copper, every place you've drawn, you take that plate and put it in an acid bath. We have big containers that are probably that deep, and they're filled with acid. And you drop the plate in there, and you have to time how long you're going to have it in there, because the longer you leave it in there, the deeper the acid eats into the lines you've exposed and creates the line. So the longer it's in there, the darker it's going to get, because the wider the line gets, and the more ink it will be able to hold when you go into printing. So once you have it in the acid bath, there are a lot of things that will affect the acid bath. Temperature will affect it. And I'm only saying this because you have to guess the strength of the acid at that point. When did they put it in? We cover them with large slabs of plastic so that the evaporation doesn't take place. But they usually do it on a regular schedule. You know, in a certain lab they'll do it every Tuesday. They'll change it. So you know that on Tuesday it's very strong. Wednesday's pretty darn strong also. And it gets weaker as it goes. So you have to adjust your own feeling for how much strength you're dealing with that acid. You combine that with the fact that you are working backwards. The plate, the image you're working on is backwards. Yeah, so you have to always be thinking in this process. I mean, it's not just slapping down, throwing paint on a canvas. You know, there's a lot to take into consideration. So once you have the plate etched to where you want it, and there are many other things that affect the etching. I mean, you can, for example, once the plate is covered and you start to draw, if something you want to be not as dark as another area, you can leave that. I mean, you can draw everything else and leave that area that's going to be lighter. put it in the acid bath. And then when you take it out of the acid bath, you'll put another coat of this retardant on the areas you've already worked on. And then work on your new areas that are going to be lighter. So that's another way of balance. You can either do the image by doing some area, let some area be in the bath longer than other areas, or you can simply time everything so that you can take a plate out and cover up some of the lines and leave some exposed and put it back in. There are a lot of ways you can do it, but every way takes a lot of mental gymnastics. I mean, you've got to pay attention to what you're doing. After the ink comes out, or after the plate comes out, acid bath, clean all that retardant off, and it has to be immaculate again. Even the oil from your hands will ruin your plate. You have to be careful not to touch the plate when it's perfectly clean or when you want it to be perfectly clean. So once you have the plate clean, you'll put it on the hot plate again, make it warm, and you'll put ink on it. Now some of the places have ink in a ball where you'll almost duplicate what we did with the retardant, only you put ink on the surface. And again, take a roller and make sure that ink is going into all the lines that the acid has eaten in the paper, or in the plate. And once you have that all inked up and everything, and we use stubs to knock that ink down into the lines and everything, and then you have to wipe off all the excess ink. And we use a material, I think it's called Tarleton. It's like crinoline, or it's a stiff fabric. If you use if you use a pair of old drawers, you're going to pull all the ink out of the lines. The paper is too soft. So this stuff cleans it off. You use a circular motion to get the ink off the plate. And then when it's all off, you're ready to print. And you can control what your print looks like by how you rub that. For example, on some of the ones I did on this, I left the moon a little darker than on others, just to see what would happen. And I did that by how I rubbed the ink away. So if I left a little more of just a dull coating on the moon, it wasn't as startling. On others, it's bright white paper. So the rubbing of the ink, or taking the ink off, is another thing that you can do to control what your picture is going to look like. So the next thing is, you take, when the ink is in the lines but off the surface, this roughly is what an etching press looks like. There's a table like bottom. There's a metal bed, and it's on rollers. And then there's a big roller on top. And then this is what you use to put the thing through. This is a moving bed. The bed moves as you use these handles, and they're usually very long, so that you can get a nice smooth turn with it. Because if you don't, you're going to get the thing going like this over your plate, and when it comes out, it's going to look like that, like you did it that way. So you want to be able to have it nice and smooth run through the press. And what happens is you'll lay down your plate. Well, this didn't work too well, but you lay down your plate on the press bed. There's a big metal bed, right? And you lay your plate down on that bed. And then take paper. And the paper is generally good quality watercolor paper, or there's a lot of print paper, paper made specifically for prints. You will have that soaking in a pan for about a half an hour before you're ready to print. And then you take that out of the water and blot the surface, take off all the excess water on this. You don't want the paper to be dry, but you want the surface to be dry. So you have the plate on the bed, you take the paper and lay that on top of the plate, and then there's what is called a felt pad, about that big, and it absorbs some of the pressure from the plate. You lay that felt pad on top of the paper. Now you're ready to run it through the press. You take those handles and make it go nice and smooth through the press. And then you peel off the pad and peel off the paper, and that's your image. It has reached into the lines that are on the plate and pulled the ink out of those lines into your drawing. Now, I skipped over an area where, in preparation of the plate, you first take your cover plate and you bevel the edges all the way around. And on the corners especially, you make a nice smooth bevel. The reason for that is if you put it into press with there's a good chance it's done. There's a good chance that when the pressure pushes metal into the metal plate, the corners of the paper will tear, or the corners where the plate meets the paper will tear. You don't want that. So that's why it's a beveled plate, to make sure that everything is going through smoothly. Does anyone have any questions so far about the process?
Yes, it's very labor intensive, isn't it?
It is.
And is this basically the way it was done in 1500?
Well, I think they didn't know there was any alternative back in before 1446, when they thought that that's what they were going to be doing all the time. Some of the real oldest, like Albert Dürer, that's all he knew was doing that. As you got later in, like Anthony van Dyck, his paintings as well as his etchings, but he did etchings. And Rembrandt, a lot of people don't realize how many etchings Rembrandt did. He did a lot of little etchings, but they're wonderful etchings. And same way with Degas. And the one that surprises me most is Gauguin. He's so colorful painting that why would he go to a black and white etching? But do. And Whistler did 400 etchings in addition. I mean, most of us know only that he painted his mother, but he also painted other things. And Toulouse-Lautrec and Bonnard and Picasso, they were all etching makers, and they did very good output of that. There's one thing I didn't take the time to get involved with, but there's color etching. And what you just heard me go through for a black plate, you have to have one for every color. And it has to perfectly match. You can't have it.
You mean one color at a time?
One color at a time.
Oh,
yeah. So, and there's another thing that people do nowadays where they'll take a painting and while it's wet, they'll take an image on paper. But they can only do one. And then that's it. So I don't know why they wouldn't just do it on paper, keep it that way. At any rate, the other thing they said, as I said, at the end of that century, dry point etching was something that they just decided. I guess some people just preferred it. And what that is you take the copper plate or zinc again, whichever, and you take your etching needle and you don't put any acid resist on. You just make sure it's very clean. And then you do your drawing on that plate. And what it does is, I mean, you're not drawing on the plate, you're drawing in the plate. The needle actually breaks the copper. So you have an edge. Everywhere you take a line, you have a little edge. And that's really what gives a kind of a fuzzy look to dry point etching. But it's a look that some people like. And in this particular one, this is just a black and white dry point etching, but I painted coloring on it, which is easier than making a 4-color etching. And so anyway, that's a possibility, is to do dry point. The problem with dry point is that those burrs, we call burrs, the edges of the line, when you run through that press, the press has tremendous pressure. And when you run through that, those burrs tend to flatten. So that after, it varies, you can't tell whether that's going to happen after 10 prints or 20 prints or when. But the burr will flatten and it'll give you a completely different look to it. Sometimes it's a better look, but you can't depend on it. It's usually not as good a look. So they don't last as long. The prints that you saw, the plate that was done, thank you. They found a way to, like I don't know how many, well, I have, down in the left-hand corner, they always put one of 200 or whatever it is. This is 35 of 50. I made 50 of these. Actually, I started so late in life to do things in art that I'm not going to hit 50 of anything, I don't think, unless it's an amazing lifetime. So anyway, the thing that can give longevity to a plate, facing, they'll call steel facing, they'll take the copper plate, and there's a process that I've never seen, but I've seen the result of it. It covers that. Everything that is metal that is exposed is covered with steel. Now how they do, I don't know if it's liquid or however, but they do it, and it is what they call steel face. And so if you can get 100 prints from this copper plate, you get 600 from steel face. So it lasts a lot longer. No, it doesn't fall apart on you. I'll show you a couple other. Actually, we have. This is the first etching I ever did, and it's celebrating its 50th birthday this year. And there again, I had been to Paris by the time I did this, but I did everything from memory. I still do everything from memory. I don't like to be on the site doing things. So this might be something you recognize or not, but it's the same in Paris. And I can point out something else that 50 years ago when this was done, as you can see, it's kind of yellowing. 50 years ago when this was done, we hadn't started talking about acid-free paper. So the acid in this has changed the color. The only part of the mat that has changed is the edge that is exposed to it. But over a number of years, the whole thing will change because the acid changes the color of the mat and everything. But it's an example, though, of how long you can go using acid-free paper before, and it's still a picture. I mean, it's not, we're very worried today about acid-free. They don't want you to even buy a picture that is not done with an acid-free mat on acid-free paper. Let me show you, this is another etching, and this is a process called aquatint. After you get your line done on the etching, if you want to use tone, they have a process called aquatint, and it involves rosin as a material. You see this sky and this treatment of the tree. That's all done. That has nothing to do with my needle. I didn't do anything. I left that the way it was. But then I did aquatint. And what you do is you take rosin, and they usually have 3 or 4 different size of grains of rosin in different size of linen bags. So that you lay your plate down, all of this stuff will be blacked out. I'll have that with the acid retardant. Everything that I did with the line, and I want to get this tone, so I take the plate and put it on the hot plate with all this blacked out, and I take my rosin bag and over the thing, shake it, and the rosin drops on this area. The more rosin you have on it, the lighter it's going to be, because the more rosin there is, it blocks out the acid. If you just put in a few drops, you're going to get a very dark sky. But the rosin, again, softens and adheres to the plate and protects it from the acid. The acid won't bother the rosin. So that's how you get tones in etching, as opposed to the line. Any questions?
When you have your acid resistant, you're covering up what you've already done
Yeah.
with acid bath. Do you also use a brush or something
You
else
can use you can
to
use,
cover up all that fine detail?
you can use a brush. Yeah,
You don't have to just...
there's liquid stop it. The stop out is the general term, I guess, for
Yeah.
that. And it's liquid, semi-liquid. I mean, you can do whatever you have to do to make sure the area is covered.
Mhm.
And then after that, the same kind of chemicals that are used to take that acid retardant off will take that off too. I mean, you can do this in spots if you like, where you take off something else and then leave everything off and then take that off, and so it's not as dark as something, everything else. So a lot of manipulation that you can go through.
So the moon is the only place that wasn't touched?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, actually, I can't say that. There are other areas in there that are not etched, but I didn't take the ink off as cleanly, you know. And then if you're not happy with the whites that you have, it's a substance like talc that you can put on a white area, and when you clean that off, there's no ink at all in there because the talcum has completely, but it's hard to use because in this it's just that little moon, and it's hard to use it without touching the edges of the other area. So, but there are ways of whitening, and people use it. And the people that do a lot of etching, some of them revert to where they're doing all the wiping with hands. There is no tarlatan, there is no fabric. They do it with hands, and they wipe themselves off and go do more on the hands. And they feel more comfortable about doing it with hands. They feel they have more control. And also the hand is more difficult. It is more difficult with the hand to pull the ink out of those lines. The fabric, even though it's stiff, occasionally will pull the ink out of the lines. Of course, you don't want the ink out of there. This is another one of my etchings. This is from that Cirque du Soleil, a character from that television series. And these I'll just show. I know you can't really see everything, so you just maybe after you're done, you can walk by and take a look. This is both line and aqua tint of an owl. This again is line and aqua tint. This was a messenger in New York that I used to see every time I went out to lunch. You know, back when they had those boom boxes. Boom box was almost as he was, walking down the street with a boom box.
That's small.
And this is called Hippies.
Yeah.
And I had one of these hanging in the hallway of my house. And didn't realize until just a few years ago that my daughter always thought that was her mother and I. This is is a Siamese fighting fish. I used to keep a fish tank in my area. This is just a more or less an etched drawing of a woman with a basket. This is another etching similar to this, called the garden seat. And it again has both aquatint and line.
So did you say that people like Rembrandt and Dürer, that they did the intaglio, or did they do something else and then intaglio came out?
Say that again.
But I thought intaglio, is that how you say it? You're working in negatives,
Yeah.
right? But would you say that that's how Dürer
No.
and Rembrandt worked, or did
No.
they do the other way where they worked with?
They bloomed. I don't know what they were doing before this was discovered in 1446, but they bloomed after that was discovered. Because, and the basis of it is someone discovered the ability to take a damp paper and make that go after your ink. Everything else was always there, just no one thought of that process. The best understanding of what happened before is woodcuts.
Yes.
You know, we cut everything away that you don't want to print.
Right.
And that's what they had to do before intaglio was
That's what I thought.
discovered. Yeah.
Oh, I have a question. What do you think about when you draw the pictures? Like when you think about just pictures?
I don't, well, etching, I don't think etching is any different, but I think maybe back then, when I was in my 20s, and that was the only art I was doing was pictures that ultimately I would turn into etchings when I had a space to do etching. I was influenced, I think, by the advertising that I was involved with, because in advertising, whether they're doing a print ad, you try as hard as you can to tell a story. Both the artist and the writer are trying to tell a story with the picture. I mean, the picture alone is fine, but if it tells a story, even to some people, then you're way ahead of the game. So when I sit down to draw, and even today, Jerry Steinfeld, they once, I don't know if you know his television show that he had, they asked him one time, where do you get your ideas? He said, I go to the idea store. I said, give me 12 of your best. And so it's the same. I think people expect you to have some special place to get your ideas from. But what I customarily do is I don't sit down at night to start watching the news or anything else without a pad. And I have a pad, and I'm doing what we would probably call doodling. And I see things in some of them that I don't see in others, and it makes me take that a little further. But I probably, of those doodles, I may have 40 doodles, and I get like 3 ideas. And then once I have the idea from the doodle, I progress, I take that further. Which is another one of my problems. I always had to spend more money for frames than anybody else because I never had standard frames. When I started doing a drawing, I had to put this here because it balanced this. And that made me go outside the lines down here. And so pretty much I had odd shapes and odd sizes, and so you had to buy
That's so funny.
yeah, extra money went into frames. But basically, that's what my ideas come from. Just thinking about it, you know.
When you were at the ad agency, could you do what your own idea was, or did you have to do what somebody else's idea?
No, well, when I went to the ad agency, you know, I had just come back from the Army. I had my art degree and all that business, but if you wanted to get, I went into a training program there. I said they had 600 people. And we had, in my training program, we had 55 guys and 1 girl. So there and 6 people in there, and your job was to work with the art department, the copy department, the merchandising department, every department, media department.
All the parts.
You were the ones that made everything cohesive. And by doing that, you learned what everybody did. And you were what was part of what I mentioned earlier, I think, a product group. A product group of someone from all those departments and someone like me who was keeping everything, we called it traffic. It was a traffic department. You know, you were pulling things together. And those 40 people on that product group solved the problems for different clients. I mean, you might have, that product group would have one client and then another group of 40 people mixing some of those same. We didn't have 40 different people for every account, but those 40 people would be responsible for coming up with the ideas for that. And they had an interesting way of doing it too. One of the creative directors that I worked with that I was most admired was we walked into his office, which might be this, he would put up butcher paper, that brown paper, floor to ceiling, all the way around. And everybody would have a marker. And you'd sit there and somebody would say something, and someone didn't have to invite you. You would walk up and you'd write an idea on that brown paper. And the only rule was you couldn't be negative. There was no negative. If someone wrote black, you could not go say, hey, wait a minute, I prefer white. No negatives. You just did positive statements all the way around. And then you started looking for who favored what. I mean, and people would slowly put together what ultimately would become a program that you could recommend to a client for advertising. And then the next step, of course, was to put that all in layouts and commercials and various things. I think every time I mentioned that I was in advertising, people do bring up that Mad Men program. I've seen one of them. I haven't seen others, but my kids really like it. And so they're always asking, do you have any anecdotes that we haven't seen on Mad Men? And I said, well, you know, I love to think there are 4 of us that every year since I left the agency, we've been meeting at the Norman Rockwell Museum. We stay overnight at the Red Lion Inn and pretty much just enjoy each other. And of the 4, 2 of them are rehabilitating alcoholics, which comes from that program. I mean, if you watch that program, 50% of the people on it probably are destined to be alcoholics. I don't know. But I had a friend of mine told me a story once where he would go home to his wife and kids, and he would say, when he was describing what had happened, he'd say, well, George and Bill and I went out at lunchtime and had a couple of martinis. Martinis were the big thing. Everybody drank martinis. It was a status thing, I think. And so every day he'd come home and say that, or sometimes he would stop with Ed and have a martini before catching the train. And so one day they were having a show and tell in school, and the teacher asked the kids, you know, what does your dad do? My dad's a fireman. And another one, what does your dad do? My dad's a plumber. And then he said, what did your dad do? And the kid said, my dad drinks teas. So there are a lot of things like that that happened that made advertising life interesting. So I think we're running over time, huh?
We're good. Thank you very much.